This is a quick general overview of the ACT reading section, and it will just give you some general strategies and the proper timing for approaching this section. So if you have time and a half, just multiply all of the times that I recommend by 1.5. Okay, so this section is 35 minutes, 40 questions, broken up into 4 different passages. This means you should be spending almost 9 minutes per passage. Some passages you'll be able to read more quickly than others. I find typically students have the most difficulty with the fiction passage because often the ideas are presented through dialogue or through metaphorical language, which can be tricky for students. So the passages will always follow this exact order. Fiction will always come first, then social sciences, then humanities, then science. One of your objectives as you do practice is to determine which of these 4 sections you are the worst at, because you want to do that section last, because you will probably feel like you are running out of time for your last section. So you don't have to do these in order. So for example, if I know that I tend to be bad at fiction, I want to start with social sciences and then go through the other sections and come back to fiction as my last section. Okay, so this is why it's really important to keep good records as you do practice sections to figure out which section you do worst on consistently. So one strategy that is going to work for a lot of you who are aiming for a score basically between 24 and 30 is to only read 3 of the passages. This means that you will skip 10 questions essentially, but it will give you 11.67 minutes per passage for the 3 passages that you read. This is a really effective strategy and it can give you a really high score. So for example, if you answer all 30 questions correctly, you can get a 31 on the section, which is an incredibly high score on the reading section. The total score is out of 36, but don't think that this means that your score is something like 31 divided by 36. It doesn't work that way. You could look at a concordance table of the ACT and SAT if you want to conceptualize how those 2 tests compare. A 31 is basically what you need for a lot of Ivy League schools. The Ivy League school range is basically 31 to 33 is really the sweet spot for Ivy League schools, and of course anything higher is going to increase your chances that much more. So if you get, let's say you get about 1 wrong per section when you do only 3 of the passages out of 4, this still can yield a very high score of 28 to 29. And if you answer 8 out of 10 questions per section, you can get a 24. So that's going to be a good goal for a lot of you to figure out which section you do the worst on and then experiment with how you do if you only answer 30 out of 40 questions, focusing on only 3 passages. Of course, if you feel that you have a little bit of time to skim the 4th passage and then give some Hail Mary answers, this is something you should absolutely do because there are no points off for wrong answers. So even if you are only answering 30 out of 40 questions, for the last 10 questions, just fill out AF, 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 because there are no points off for wrong answers. That means just filling out the first letter in your bubble sheet just so that you're sticking with 1 letter, and you should hit some answers that are correct because they do try to vary the answer choices. All right, so don't skip questions on the ACT. This is a really big point. People get it confused with the SAT all the time. You don't lose points for wrong answers. Tough questions can cost you time, so something you really want to practice is knowing when to bail on a question. So if you're having a terrible time deciding between 2 answer choices, circle in your test booklet the answer that you think is best and then put a question mark next to the question in general so that you know to circle back to that question if you have time at the end. Also, make sure you're just tracking your thought process as you process the question, so make sure you're crossing out bad answers as you identify that they're bad. I would also say underline keywords in the answer choice and then try to see if those words are evoking the language of the passage or the ideas of the passage. Something that's kind of unusual about the ACT compared to the SAT is that it will use language directly from the passage, not just paraphrasings of the passage. So don't be scared away from answers that have the exact language of the passage. This is something that the ACT does quite often. Inference questions, so questions that ask you to draw a logical conclusion based on clues given in the passage. These tend to be difficult. Drawing a conclusion is one type of inference question. They'll basically say, it would be logical to conclude this based on the question. There are also questions that have the words except or none in them. And These questions are very difficult to process properly, even though the ACT gives you a lot of help by capitalizing the words except and none. Many students will overlook the fact that the question says except or none. So when I see except or none, I try to highlight it by circling it and putting kind of some stars around it, some lines emanating from the circle surrounding the word except or none, just to really call my attention to the fact that this is a special kind of question. Another clue that you have an except or none question is that you're going to think that two or more answers, really and truly 3 out of the 4 answers, should be great for if you are answering the wrong question. So if you're overlooking the fact that it says except or none and answering kind of the opposite question, you're going to like 3 out of the 4 answers. This is a clue to reread the question and see if it's an except or none question. Here are some qualities of the classically wrong answers on the ACT. So often the answers are too specific and they have details that are not relevant to the passage, not mentioned in the passage. There's a lot of answers that are just too negative, especially in the fiction passage. Often they will describe one character's perspective of another character in terms that are just much too negative and dramatic for what is actually presented. Similarly, sometimes they will have answers that are too positive. So someone's just kind of tolerating, let's say, Bobby tolerates the character Susan, just thinks she's kind of annoying but deals with her. They might have an answer choice that says that Bobby's view of Susan is that she's a wonderful person and he'd really like to get to know her. This is too positive for what the passage says. Other words that tell you that it is probably a wrong answer are really certain words like prove, cause. These are really dramatic words that are usually not true of the passage. Also, other strong words like hate are usually wrong. Words like hate, love, detest, loathe, those kind of words you want to be really skeptical about. All right, so here's the breakdown of the timing you should use for these passages. You should take about 3 minutes if you have normal time, and then just multiply that times 1.5 if you have time and a half to speed read the passage. Your objective is not to understand everything thoroughly or carefully. It's just to get a general sense of where the information is so that you can go back and reread as needed. Star or circle lists and figurative language. Also, try to get a sense of the order of the events because often there are questions about order of events. And circle dates and proper names because those are very common kinds of questions that they will ask. So here's an example of a list that would be in a passage, and you can pretty much guarantee that they're going to ask you about this list. So the passage might say, we planted corn, barley, and kale. And the question will say they planted all of the following except, and then they'll have a list of agricultural goods, and you have to go back and find this list and figure out what isn't in the list. These are just words that signal the order of events. These are going to be important because so many questions ask about the order of events. So now, then, later, before, after, 1985, dates, 18th century, things like that are telling you that the passage is giving you information about when things happened chronologically. Proper names, so just actual names like Fran, names of species, especially in the science section, so like Australopithecus, or locations like Bangladesh. And usually these will be capitalized. Sometimes for species names, they'll be italicized, which is helpful. Also really anticipate that they will ask you about weird visual imagery presented in the passage and metaphorical language. So here are just some examples from passages. Dragon lady nails, they're going to ask you what that means. Asteroid husband is a weird figurative term, meaning that this husband travels away and then returns. Pheasants greedily eating grapes. You can really expect that they're going to ask you about that, and you can circle these terms or star them so that you can very quickly locate them when you have to answer a question about this. All right, I'm going to make a separate video about the tips that are specific to each kind of passage. So look for that. I will break it down by fiction, humanities, social sciences, science, and you can watch those individually.